Okay, so we've officially started recording, and welcome along to everybody that's joining us this evening. Today is the 15th of September, so through the middle of the month already. It's not going to be a very long lesson. I think that we're going to do a bit of a review from what we did last week on democracy. I gave you some principles about that. And then there's a little history lesson, which sort of ties in with the 108 notes that you've been doing. And then we'll talk about positional sanctification, something that just came up in the last week. And then we'll have a look at the Greek homework that we had for 108. I can see that most of you are still having problems with the articles and the date of case, so we'll have a look at that. There's still a few people who haven't got their homework in yet, but I can give a little bit of an extension. And it's definitely, I can see that a lot of you are struggling with the Greek. So again, we just have to keep going through it slowly and just step by step as we go through. But before we get into the lesson today, we'll just name our sins quietly to God the Father in order that we can be sure that we have fellowship with Him and have the power of the Holy Spirit as we focus on these doctrinal things, the Word of God. So let's just bow our heads. Father, Sir, we give thanks to you for this time and the opportunity that we have to study these biblical subjects this evening. We give thanks for the power of the Holy Spirit, who is our mentor and allows us to take in these things into our souls as spiritual information in order that they would be effective in our spiritual lives. And so we give thanks for this time in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so I'll just go through what we did last week. And what are we up to here? Okay, we're looking at democracy because in the 108 notes, we're talking about the emperors of Rome, and we'll get into that later a little bit. And it's a slightly different subject, but remember, democracy has been around since the time of the Greeks. The Athenians were the first ones that came up with democracy as recorded in history. And so that was about 500 years before the time of Christ, of course. Let me just turn off my... I've got my screensaver on, so it's... And a lot of people, they think that democracy is the greatest thing for governments. We actually do see just historically that when Jesus Christ comes back, he's going to be the ruler of the millennium. He's not going to set up a democracy. And even that just tells us that, if God is deciding that he's going to be the ruler of the world, and he will allow us a lot of freedom, of course, but not to select the rulers. He's going to appoint the rulers. And that is the best form of democracy. In the meantime, we do see these principles that tell us that democracy is it's a reasonable system of government as long as the people are good. And that's the way all governments operate. If people, if they're following the spiritual life, if you have a majority of people in a country and they're living the spiritual life, then God will bless that nation. And this is called blessing by association. And on the other hand, when people fall away from God and his plan, then there's a lot of cursing in the land. That's cursing by association as well. So just what we had last week, we were talking about how Greece was that's the birthplace of democracy, and that Plato himself, he said that when you let people govern themselves under a democracy, it ultimately leads to the masses supporting tyranny. And the reason is because you have a tyrant, and the reason he becomes a tyrant is because he can become very influential over certain people. And you have to remember that all systems of government, it's run by, when you talk about people have their sin natures. There's different trends of the sin nature, and they're going to follow their trends. And even you just look at politicians today, and you say, what does inspire the politician to get into politics? And even if they start off with very good intentions, it's like people that could get into becoming a lawyer, for example, You have this good intention, you want to help out people, you're maybe a patriot, you want to help the country, and then when you get into that system, it can corrupt. And that's why we have this idiom in English, actually, we say power corrupts. And it's very simple, power corrupts. You get into power, and you start off in the local government, and then you can see how you're going to be influenced unless you have a strict moral compass. And the moral compass for Christians comes from the Bible. So unless you're going to stand firm, stand fast on biblical principles, you're going to be swayed. And that's what happens. A lot of people get into politics. There's nothing wrong with going into politics, and maybe God has appointed Christians in your community that people should be getting involved in positions of leadership. And if those people stand firm to doctrine, if they stand firm to God's principles, then God can use them, of course. But anyway, in a democracy, power belongs to anyone who can influence the people. And if the people are good and making good decisions, they'll elect a good leader. And oppositely, if they don't know how to think, and I've seen a lot of clips on YouTube, for example, they're interviewing people in the United States, very important election year for the United States. And as a client nation, whoever gets to become in government, that has a big effect on world policies. What happens regarding Israel, what happens regarding, they're talking about tariffs on China and Russia and things like this as well. So it's very important, and you should probably follow the election. You got Kamala Harris against Donald Trump, and two quite opposing views, but they do have certain things that they do see eye to eye on, that they agree with. But I've seen them go out and interview people, and they could be like, these students, they can vote from the time of 18 years old, and the person would ask them, who do you want to vote for? And a lot of them, the younger people, are saying, well, we want to vote for Kamala Harris. And they say, why are you voting for her? And because she's a woman, and we want a woman president. And they identify with her in certain ways or whatever. But the reason these people are voting is not based on any reasonable principles. It's like when Barack Obama became president, and he's a total socialist, and they say he still wields a lot of power today. And the majority of people, I think, that voted for Obama, they're either saying, well, we voted for him because he's a Democrat, and we've been Democrats for generations in the family, or just that he's black, and they wanted a black man as president, not because of his merit, not because he had good policies or anything, but just because he was because he was black. So you can see how it's people are not voting based on truth or whatever the policies are, which is very sad, but that's the way things go. And so when they vote in for like a socialist or Marxist type government, then these people are dooming themselves, they're cursing themselves through their bad decisions. But that's how God's plan works. You make bad decisions, you have to face the consequences. Many forms of government have been, this is a quote from Winston Churchill here, the Prime Minister of England during World War II. Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or wise. Indeed, it's been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried. And again, it completely depends on the people. And he gives the quote here, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. And again, you see these people that are doing interviews with voters, young voters, especially the young people. They're very idealistic. They have their agenda. A lot of the young people today, they're focused on issues which they think are important, like the environment, what they talk about with these woke policies. They have these DEI initiatives. DEI is diversity, environment, and inclusion, I think it is. And all these matters are very evil when you look at it, but they're voting for these evil things. Globalization, giving power to organizations like the World Health Organization, which is an international globalist organization. The UN, they like the UN getting involved in things. This is how the liberal kind of people think. And it goes opposite the laws of divine establishment. We should be voting for countries which are for leaders, that respect national boundaries and that are patriots. And it's almost got to the stage where patriotism has become a bad word. But we should be patriots. You should be praying for your nation, and you should respect your nation and the nation's borders and the borders of other nations as well. Okay, so remember Satan's plan to break down national borders. He wants to take over control of the world. He can become the leader of the world, the one world government. This is talked about in the book of Revelation, because when he can break down the boundaries, it's easier for him to control things. It's easier for him to destroy the client nation, as we see is happening today. Open borders, with people pouring in from all places of the world with all their different kinds of thinking, which is not based on the Bible. Traditionally, the client nation has the biblical thinking. And when you get lots of Catholics coming in, for example, and they have certain principles they adhere to from the Bible, but there's others that aren't. And a lot of Islamists are coming in, a lot of communists coming in. So the whole background, or the whole culture of the United States is changing. Let's move on to the next slide anyway. So, and we looked at examples about democracies, how Hitler came to power under democracy, and we see how that turned out. The People's Republic of China, it's a communist government with a market economy, and it's done very well until recently, because the government has often propped up a lot of their big projects, and now we're seeing that the housing prices are plunging. I just read on the news recently, it's some cities, the house prices have come down, the land prices, by 10% over the year. And a lot of people rely on the prices of housing going up, because that becomes like their capital. And you imagine if you need to buy a house, you go to the bank, you get a mortgage. Say you got a mortgage out for, well, let's say, talking in pesos, it could be a million pesos to help buy your home. And then in the next year, you've got a million peso loan on your house, but the house is now only worth 900,000 pesos, and you've still got to pay off the million pesos plus the interest on top of that. And that's what a lot of people are facing in China at the moment, because a lot of the growth has been stemming from where the government has been promoting big housing developments, building whole cities in China actually. So there's a huge glut of housing. The electric vehicles you see, the companies were promoted by the Chinese government. They're propped up with subsidies, even in other countries, because of the green. And again, it's that very evil movement. The environmental movement goes against God's plan, because one big motivation for the environmentalists is they think that the world is going to be destroyed and mankind is going to, we're going to be flooded under huge amounts of water when the ice caps melt and things like this. This is just a total lie. But Satan uses that because he wants to give control to the governments. And when he gives control to the governments, and he can take control over the governments, it's easy to control the people. It's all about control. And China, they've just got huge huge car lots where they keep these electric vehicles ready for export, and the cars are just sitting there. In Thailand even, there's 500,000 electric vehicles sitting unsold in different vehicle lots and car dealerships around the country. But they don't talk about these things in the local news normally, or in the mainstream news, because they want to paint this picture that everybody should be in electric vehicles. And then we have talking about democracy in China, what I notice, it's interesting. It's not actually it's not a true communist country, and they do at a lot of levels. They have elections, and I see this. I watch a lot of Chinese, not like soap operas, but Chinese movies and things like that, because I'm trying to keep my Chinese practice up for my ministry there. And they talk about, you have these in universities and schools and things like that. They always have these class elections, and in the local communities, they elect local people. You still have to be a member of the Communist Party generally, but they do believe in sort of electing, try to find the best people for different jobs until you get up to the very highest level of power. So they do have this aspect of choosing people, democracies. And then you have it in Laos, for example, they call it the Lao People's Democratic Republic, though that's a communist government. And then North Korea, see, this is the name for North Korea we had here, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So when you talk about democracy, it can be quite confusing. There's no sort of hard and fast rules about it. Generally, the problem is people associate democracy with freedom. And the United States has tried to export democracy around the world since World War II, really. And that's what started the Cold War as well. But the USA has lost much respect and power, and billions, actually trillions of dollars really wasted trying to export democracy, and they try to promote it as freedom. Now, the only freedom that we have is spiritual freedom in the world. That's the true freedom that we talk about, and the freedom that comes through from the laws of divine establishment, of course. But democracy and freedom are not the same thing. And again, we just saw, like, for example, with Hitler coming to power, and then it basically enslaved a lot of people under the Marxist and Nazi party rule, where you couldn't do anything without the Nazis signing off on it. So it's just something that we need to be aware of, is it's not the same thing. And we had the example of the failed war in Afghanistan. They're trying to export democracy. The role of a client nation to other nations is not to try to whitewash the devil's world. This is a term that the colonel used. And whitewashing, you get a wall sometimes, like the wall of a house, or the wall around your house, and it starts to look a bit, we say cruddy, it looks a bit broken down, and you try to make it look a little bit better, and so you have this very cheap paint, and you take the paint and you paint the wall, and it looks slightly better, but all you've done is you've covered over the cracks in the wall, and that's called whitewashing the devil's world. Actually, I'll put it up here as a, let me just share this. I'll bring it up on the whiteboard so you can see it. And you might have a similar expression, I guess, in your, in Visign or something, but we live in the devil's world. This is Cosmos Diabolicus. Okay, you've probably heard this is the sort of, it's actually Greek mixed with Latin, because cosmos is a Greek word, and then actually diabolicus comes from a diabolos, which is the devil. So I think the ending is Latin on this. They have the Latin declensions on it. But this is the devil's world. And this is what the United States does when it tries to export democracy. What it should be doing is exporting the word of God and going out, sending the missionaries out. And the government should not get involved in mission work. It shouldn't get involved in the church. They talk about the separation of state and church, or church and state. And really what that means is that the government shouldn't get involved in the church, and the church shouldn't get involved in the government. And of course the government, people in the power and political power, they should be applying biblical principles. But the church can't say to the government, you need to do this and you need to do that. And the government shouldn't be saying to the churches, you can worship at this time and you can't do it at that time, etc. But anyway, so what the people from the client nation, one of the responsibilities is to go out and to preach the word. So send out the missionaries. And the United States has done a pretty good job of that. As long as the missionaries are doctrinal, and we are recipients of that grace, where we've had missionaries come out to the Philippines and all around Asia, to Thailand, like when Max Klein came out. This is a direct blessing to myself and my family, because of the client nation sending up missionaries. And you've all been recipients of that as well, because of course you've received some very good doctrinal teaching. So let me just go back to here. So and we should always be praying for that as well, that the missionaries continue to function properly, that they continue to be supported properly, and that the client nation continues to do its job like that. Okay, so I think that's about that. Oh, and we had a conclusion that a nation is only as good as its people, including its rulers. Okay, because people, stupid people vote for stupid rulers, evil people will vote for evil rulers, people with, knowledge and wisdom, they will vote for leaders with knowledge and wisdom. And then R.B. Them Jr. is quoted, as goes the church, and it begins with the pastors. He often blamed the pastors. When the pastors in a client nation, if they're not teaching properly, of course the congregation, they fail in their spiritual life. And then when they're failing, then you're not getting wise people into rulership. It's like, the whole population is stupid, or evil, as it were. So of course the leaders are going to be ignorant and stupid and evil. And then as goes the client nation, who is supposed to be an influence, a good influence on the world, then so goes the world. And another concept we have to remember also is that when the client nation fails, unless another nation is going to pick up the baton and pick up that role and responsibility, then we come into what's called a dark ages. And the dark ages is where there's no good influence in the world to push back against the evil. And that happened during the time, and they actually call it the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church was nascent, going in its increase, from really from the time about the 5th century AD until about the 1500s. And there was a huge religious vacuum until the time of the Protestant Reformation. And during that time, there was a lot of evil going on in the world. There was not a lot of progress in terms of even like science and mathematics and culture and things like that. And then once the Protestant Reformation took place in Europe, then we see this great period of what they call enlightenment. And God was able to bless people, the scientists and the rulers. A lot of them were Christians. The great, the writers and the musicians, people like Jonathan Bach and you have Beethoven, people like this, either they were Christians or heavily influenced by Christianity. And then of course colonialism, which came out, a lot of that came from Christianity as well, from Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, these rulers that were promoting biblical principles around the world. Okay, but that's another subject for another day, really. So the most successful form of government is one that recognizes the role of the government and to provide an environment of freedom under that principle of freedom to succeed and freedom to fail. And so, if people are going to fail because they're evil, they should be allowed to do that. It's not where the government has to step in and say, okay, we're going to give you lots and lots of money, which is not the government's money to give. Remember, they're just going to take it from the wealthy people. And the wealthy people, eventually they say, well, we've had enough, and that they move somewhere else. They go to another nation, or they hide their money away or whatever. So governments are continuously trying to prop up the failures in a nation through socialism, through communism. And the way they do that is the Robin Hood method. Robin Hood, if you've heard of Robin Hood, he was an English sort of legend, I guess, a bit of a myth. But they say that he used to rob from the rich and give to the poor. And if you're a socialist, you like that. You think, oh, that's a good idea. But robbing, stealing in any form and whatever the motivation is a wrong thing. They might say it's a right thing, but it's definitely in a wrong way. And to give money to the poor, okay, that's a good thing. But if you're stealing from the wealthy to do that, then obviously that's wrong. That's stealing, either way you look at it. Okay. Now, another subject, and this is because in 108 we've been talking about Augustus Caesar, and you read through the lessons on that, and then the next lesson we're going to be talking about the Roman emperors still. I just want to give you a brief rundown on the Roman emperors and the attitudes towards Jews and Christians, because as you get through the first century of the church, there's a lot of persecution against the Christians. And the persecution against the Christians, of course, you have to realize everything is under God's sovereignty, Jesus Christ controlling history, and he's basically putting pressure, allowing pressure to be put on the church, because through those persecutions, people are able to exhibit their faith, and then through that the church can expand. And the church, Christianity grew massively in that first century, and a lot of that has come through the persecution. And there was a lot of what we call Christian martyrs. Actually, I'll give you another word here. We talk about the word martyr in English, which means somebody that's basically they're dying for their faith. Let's come back to here. Let me just get rid of this one. In English, martyr, sorry. Okay, we have the word martyr. Every religion has their martyrs, people they're willing to die for their faith. In Islam, usually the martyr is willing to blow themselves up and kill thousands of people, which is actually murder. They think they go to their Allah heaven and they can have their 70 virgins or whatever it is. So that's not a good impression of a martyr. But in the Bible, we see this word many times. I can't put it in the Greek, but martyrion. Now remember, in the Greek, you have a Y in the English, but when you go from the Greek, it's actually the upsilon. So in the Greek, I can't do the Greek on this, but this would be the mu and the alpha. You have the rho, which is the R sound, the tau for the T, and then U is upsilon. But you have the word martyrion, and this is the word they'll always translate into English as witness. And you see this many times that we're supposed to be witnesses for Jesus Christ. And then just to give an example, like in Revelation, during the time of the tribulation, we have Moses and Elijah coming back as the heralds for Jesus Christ. And when a king arrives, you have to have a herald. He's going to announce the arrival of the king. And this is what Moses and Elijah are doing halfway through the tribulation. They're going to appear on the earth in their interim bodies, not the resurrection bodies, because remember, you only get your resurrection body at the end of the dispensation. There's still 7 years of the age of Israel to be completed, or halfway through the tribulation, 3.5 years left. But Elijah and Moses come back from heaven, and the Lord is saying that these are the witnesses. There's actually a whole lot of other witnesses, 144,000 others as well. But Moses and Elijah are called witnesses, and like the 144,000. So this is the word martyrion. And a witness doesn't just mean that you're out witnessing. They talk about witnessing, of course, telling other people about Jesus Christ. And that's another definition of witness, is you witness to somebody how Jesus Christ saved you, how Jesus Christ has changed your life through his word, through his doctrine, for example. But another kind of witness as well, and the supreme witness, is somebody that is willing to, under great pressure, to say, well, you're saying that if I don't give up my faith in Jesus Christ, then I'm going to have my head cut off, or you're going to kill me or put me in jail or whatever. And you say, you could do that. I can't fight you, of course, but because you have too much physical power. Maybe someone's got a gun at your head, or the government has come, people knocking at your door, like they used to do during the time of the Romans, and they've taken you away. And you just have to accept that this is your fate, that this is your role, and you become a witness. Okay, so that's the word martyr. So witness and martyr, this is the same concept in the Bible. Okay, sorry, where am I going here? So let's go back to, hang on. Share, here we go. Screens. Okay, so during the time of the early church, what you did have was that you had many of the Roman emperors, they were persecuting the Christians. Now, the reasons why they were doing that can be quite complex. And a lot of it just relates to that they had a lot of fear of the Christians, and that the Christians, there's a lot of arrogance involved in this as well. Going right back to the time of the Roman Republic, there's actually laws in place that any pagan religion outside of the Roman religion, they had their pantheon of their gods, and they would be worshipping. You had people like Olympus, and you had all of the whole, we say a pantheon, Zeus, and all their Poseidon, their Greek gods. And so anytime you had other religions being promoted, this was going to cause what they would think would be a downfall of their culture and their society. It sort of threatened their society. And then you have the emperor worship, which was made a part of that as well. A lot of the emperors, they set themselves up as gods, as deities. So we call this the deification, like the deification of the Caesars. Okay, so, but during the time of the early church, I'll just give you some examples here. This is, these were the emperors which were well known for their persecution of the Christians. You have Claudius from 41 to 54. Something else you have to realize about the persecution of the Christians, it wasn't just the Christians, it was often the Jews together, and the Roman people, because they didn't understand Christianity at that time, and a lot of the Christians were Jews who became Messianic Jews, which means they'd heard the message from teaching of people like Paul and Apollos and other evangelists that had come through, Jewish people hearing the gospel, and they became Christian. But for the Roman people, they didn't understand that, so they just put them all into the same group. And what they would think was that the Christians were just another denomination of the Jews, and which is from a sort of what do we call it? A secular viewpoint, looking in on the religion of the Jews and the Christians. That's a sort of a fair statement to make. That's a logical conclusion for these people, is that the Christians were just another sect of the Jews. So they all got put together. So often it's not just the Jews being persecuted, but not just the Christians, but the Jews together. And for example, when a decree would go out that you had to worship the emperor, then if the decree went out, it would be both the Jews and the Christians which would go against that decree. And a lot of the holidays, the pagan holidays that they had, they say pagan, the holidays that the Romans would be worshipping their gods, the Jews and the Christians, they would not be doing that. And then the neighbors, for example, if somebody was had Christian or Jewish neighbors, they would see this, and of course there's going to be fear coming in, or there's a lot of ignorance about that, which they might report that to the authorities and say, how our neighbors are not worshipping Nero, or they're not worshipping Vespasian, and then the people would come out and persecute them. Okay, but with Claudius 41 to 54, since the Jews were continually making disturbances at the instigations of Christus. Now this is from the word Christos, Jesus Christ. So in their writings they would call him Christus. He, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So that would be the Jews and the Christians were expelled from Rome. This was written by a Roman historian, his name is Suetonius, about the events that were happening in Rome about 52. And you can imagine that the Christians and Jews, for example, they might be arguing in the synagogue about how Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and they could go to the Old Testament, they'd be reading through that, and then, oops, I've lost my connection, hang on. I think we just lost the internet connection for a bit. So the Jews and the Christians could be arguing, those arguments could come into the public arena, and in that case then Claudius would say, well, we need to clamp down on this, we can't have any disturbances in the community, and then he would persecute them. Now Nero is the emperor that executed Paul, beheaded Paul. That was about the year 68 actually, in the same year that Nero executed Paul, and Nero himself was murdered by the Praetorian Guard as his own. They were supposed to be looking after him. But Nero was this crazy guy. He had his mother stabbed to death for treason. His wife Octavia was beheaded for adultery. Whether she did commit it or not, we don't know for sure, but he accused her of adultery. And to show how mad he was, he had Octavia, that's his wife, head displayed for his mistress Poppaea, and then years later he kicked his mistress to death when she was pregnant. So obviously here we have this crazy, violent man who had become emperor. There was a great fire of Rome in 64 AD, and Nero tried to pin the blame on the city's Christian community. and they were regarded as a distinct dissident group of Jews. So again, just like Claudius, he's looking at the Christians as some kind of a denomination of the Jewish people, and so he burned many of them alive. And then we have the sort of the legend of Nero, that he was playing his fiddle, playing his violin as the city burned. Whether that's true or not, we don't really know, but that's how the story goes. Vespasian as well, he's another emperor. So there are a lot of emperors through here that are all very anti-Semitic and anti-Christian. Vespasian 69 to 79. It was Vespasian and then his son Titus that we have here, who were responsible for destroying Jerusalem. And there was a big campaign where they'd gone in and over the space of about 3 or 4 years, but actually it started even before then, that the Romans eventually destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. But remember, that was prophesied by Jesus Christ as well. Okay, when Jesus said, this temple won't even be completed, and then all the temple stones will fall down, that you won't even see one stone on top of another. And that campaign was begun by Vespasian and then completed by his son. Vespasian, he died in I think about April or May of 79 AD. And then there was a few other emperors. There's 2 other emperors that came in his place, and then Titus, the son of Vespasian, became the emperor towards the end of that same year. And during that year, we had 4 emperors of Rome during that time. But Vespasian, at the beginning of that year, 79 AD, he was the emperor, and then you had 2 other emperors. One was murdered, another committed suicide, and then you have Titus. And actually Vespasian was murdered as well. And you see that with a lot of these emperors. You see, despite Rome being this great empire, is that the emperors have been murdered a lot of the time. So it was unusual that the name is Galatian, maybe one of the emperors during that year, he committed suicide, or so they say. But a lot of them just got murdered. So a lot of infighting. Domitian, he came out, and now Domitian is the son, he's another son of Vespasian actually as well, so he's the brother of Titus. So once Titus died, then Domitian took over, and these are called the Flavian Caesars, Flavian. So you have this period of the Flavian Caesars, and as far as the general ruling, I think a lot of people were happy with the way that they ruled. Generally, to the general Roman populace, they were quite good rulers. But again, we're talking about the persecution of the Jews and Christians, destroying the Temple of Jerusalem, very anti-Semitic, of course. So there was a great cursing involved in that, including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 80 AD. So that was part of the punishment upon the Romans. If you might have seen the movie Pompeii, it's called, I think. There's a lot of fantasy in the movie Pompeii, but also you see the destruction of Pompeii city when Mount Vesuvius exploded. It was a volcano, a big eruption in 80 AD. And a lot of the people that died there were the Roman aristocrats and those that had a lot of the ruling power, and that had been involved in the destruction of Jerusalem and then taking of Jews into slavery. A lot of them would have had Jewish slaves as well from that event. So this is God's discipline down upon them. And that was during the reign of Titus. But then, so you have the son of Vespasian, and Vespasian, so Titus, and then Domitian. And Domitian as well, he was into persecuting the Jews and the Roman and the Jews and Christians as well. To the extent he had John exiled to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. But that was God's plan. That John was captured, he was taken into captivity and put on the Isle of Patmos. There is a extra biblical writing that John was actually tortured. He was put into a vat of boiling oil. I think this comes through the Roman Catholic legends, and that he survived that by a miracle, and then he escaped. So, but that's sort of in the Catholic literature. And then you have Trajan, 98 to 117, and this is actually at the beginning of the golden age of Rome, but he was continuing the persecution of the Christians and was a fan of the bloody displays of the horror of the gladiatorial games. A lot of the emperors, and even with the Roman populace, the Roman citizens, they love those gladiator games. And during those games, a lot of the time, a lot of the entertainment was what you see here, the persecution of the Christians, of course, being thrown to the lions. So that was a lot of the entertainment. You see Christians being strung up on crosses around here. It's probably not very clear, but the Roman people, they love that. That was their entertainment. And as society declines, people get into violence for entertainment. You see that these days, they do a lot of, when I grew up, boxing used to be, you always have the boxing gloves on, and now you see it with the mixed martial arts, and there's a lot of blood in the arena and stuff like that. So we see the society declining in that way. I think violence is becoming more mainstream, and it could only get worse, of course. Okay, so that brings up the end of the topic for that. Oh, and just this final quote, I think this is before we get into here. So there's an English historian, Edward Gibbon, famous historian. He wrote this very famous book, The History of the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's quite a famous, it's a famous book for historians. He writes that the Roman citizens converting to Christianity instilled a feeling of apprehension in their pagan neighbors. So there's this fear. And it wouldn't be unlike, for example, if you have people from a foreign culture and they move into your neighborhood, and without God in your life, knowing that God's going to protect you, you could be quite fearful about what's happening. And he writes there, by embracing the faith of the gospel, the Christians incurred the supposed guilt of an unnatural and unpardonable offense. Remember, we've got generations of people that have believed in their Roman pantheon. And of course, the emperors are supposed to support that. That's part of almost like it's the religious culture that goes up to the top of politics. They dissolved the sacred ties of custom and education. Let's talk about Christians with their Christian faith. So what they thought were sacred ties of custom and education, they violated the religious institutions of their country through truth. So remember, religion is false. You see this even in Thailand, a lot of the Thai Buddhists, and you have a neighbor, they become Christian, and depending on the behavior of the Christians and also the attitude of the neighbors, there could be a lot of fear, there's persecution there as well. And these people are presumptuously despised whatever their fathers had believed as true or had, I've lost the internet connection, or had reverenced as sacred. Okay, so there's a lot of fear that stems from the unknown. So when you have a neighbor and they're evangelized, they believe in Jesus Christ, that causes a lot of fear for people. And that leads to that persecution. And all promoted by Satan. Always keep it in context of the angelic appeal trial. Of course, it's Satan. He has an immense amount of power, and he will use that to try to destroy Christian culture. But on the other hand, God is using evil for good. All things work together for good for those who love him. And like you see these Christians here, they're bowing to God, praying to God. You would hope that they're in fellowship, and that they can find some kind of a peace, even as they're going through that the death-shadowed valley in their final few moments on the earth. Okay. So that brings up that, just to finish off the topic about democracy and governments and things like that. Any questions about that? Okay, if there's no questions, what I'll do, because we've
Is that Pastor Tim Nero is that what we call the Mad Emperor? That his other nickname, Mad Emperor?
Well, there's a lot of them. Nero was mad. Claudius was considered mad, and even then before him, you had little bits. Caligula. Caligula was considered a mad emperor. And Caligula, he did a lot of murdering of his family. I think he possibly
Even
murdered
Emperor
his sons. So
he's the harsh.
Go ahead.
But Nero is the number one harsh emperor in the history of Roma, right?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but you see, yeah, because when Nero, for example, when he, what does it say here, that he had his mother stabbed to death, killed his wife, and then eventually killed his mistress with, who was pregnant with his child as well. So you have to be mad. But Herod was doing that as well. Remember King Herod, and King Herod, he was from the Herodian Empire, and he was part Jewish as well, actually. Towards the end of his reign, he'd become absolutely mad as well. And a lot of these people, the madness stems from they're just trying to hang on to their power, and there's a lot of paranoia, especially when they're making bad decisions, and then people are actually literally out to get them. And so he hears rumors, so and so is trying to kill you, and maybe he thinks that the son is trying to take over his throne, and he goes out and kills his sons, which is what Herod did as well. Definitely Nero was mad. Maybe he's called the Mad Emperor because he was the maddest, but all of these people here are mad or crazy in some way or another.
Pastor Tim,
Yep.
regarding the life of Titus, is it not Titus who destroyed the temple of Jerusalem and invaded Jerusalem?
That's right. And what actually happened was Vespasian started the campaign. He was the general, and he was sent out by the previous emperor, and I think that was
Vespasian?
Hello?
If you just go back to the what you call that, the previous slide.
Yep.
Like that.
Yeah. So, and I think the command originally came under Nero. He's the previous emperor here. I think there might have been another emperor in between them, but the campaign against Jerusalem, excuse me, had been going on for many years before then. And Jerusalem had been actually besieged going right back to maybe 65 or 66 BC. And the different sort of campaigns that went on. And Vespasian, at that first initial point, he was a general. And then when Nero died, and then eventually Vespasian went back to Rome, and that's where he was set up as emperor. But he sent Titus in his place. So Titus took over the place of Vespasian. And at that stage, Titus then became the general, and it was under Titus's reign that eventually Jerusalem was destroyed. And the temple was destroyed as well.
But how about this date, Pastor Tim? Titus just started in 79 to 81 AD, and Jerusalem was just destroyed in AD 70. Can you enlighten us or explain?
Yeah, if you see here, because in 69, these numbers here, this is like when he became the emperor. So up until 69, Vespasian had been leading that campaign in Jerusalem, against Jerusalem to destroy the Jews effectively. But in 69, he got called back. So that's when he became the emperor, and then his son became the general in charge of that campaign. So his legacy, so when we say not only include the persecution of Christians, but the demolition of the temple of Jerusalem, he wasn't involved, he wasn't there when the temple was destroyed, but he certainly led up to that, and then he appointed his son to finish that off. So as the emperor, he was still demanding that they destroy the temple. So that was really the decision of Vespasian, even though it was his son that was leading the campaign to destroy Jerusalem. If you get
that. This date, 79.
So sorry, the date 79 to 81. That's when Titus
This is the time
was
that
emperor.
Titus became also what we call that emperor. Or
Yeah, that's right. So he was emperor for 10 years, from 79 to 81.
So, but Jerusalem was just destroyed in 70 AD during Vespasian as emperor.
That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. I'll tell you what we'll do now because it's coming close to 8 o'clock for you. So let's just take a break for say 5 minutes. And when I come back here, there's just a little bit of doctrine that I want to mention to you, and then a little bit about the Greek as well. So we just take a quick break, and then we'll come back at say 7:55. Okay. And I'll stop the recording here.